Hi everybody, welcome joining today's Phraktion P2P webinar series. Maybe next slide. Yes. For those that you don't know me, I'm Nigel Biswas-Wobbing, co-founder of Phraktion. I think also joined by Paul and Gordon as co-founders of Phraktion today. We have a bold ambition at Phraktion, really trying to change how pharma works, and really doing that by building a community of pharma experts working together in life sciences, exchanging knowledge and skills. We actually developed an online facility to help us to do that. I'm sure you've all seen that, and if not, really get online and try and use that to your best advantage. We're really connected together to deliver projects or solve any problem, either individually or as teams. And in doing so, really, set out that ambition to really shape the future of the biopharma industry and how we work, actually. So, next slide, please, Cass.
We broke the 750 barrier today as well. We're now 751 partners.
Fantastic. So, really, from small acorns, large oak trees are beginning to form, I think. Also, fantastic news with the 750. So, but probably the main focus of today, of course, should be our wonderful webinar to be presented by Cassandra Rix, I think. We can call you Cass, I think.
You can, unless you're annoyed with me, in which case feel free to say Cassandra if you don't think you're getting my attention.
and Cass is going to talk about there's no such thing as a toxic leader, debunking the myth, perhaps. But I guess coming to these webinars, we've done them for a little while now. I mean, it's sort of incredible the depth of experience and expertise we have on offer, and always throughout our talkers and also within our audience. And really talks also, I think, to the real rich diversity of all the different functions and different aspects that we come to in pharma, whether that's very scientific, maybe that's my hat, but all the way through different subjects. Like last time we talked about creating a country affiliate and the challenges around that, and maybe a fractional strategy is a good one to go down. And sort of more technical, Nick Moore to start here looking at sort of early development challenges. And today we really take a different direction, looking at leadership, if you like. And I think amongst all that mix of stuff, I think what we really do need is great people and being led together and acting as one team often. So with that, Cass, maybe you can give introduction yourself. I think one thing I do know about you, Cass, is you're maybe at least an ex bodybuilder, so we really shouldn't mess with you this afternoon. And I won't challenge you to an arm at least. But with that, Cass, over to you.
Thank you, Nigel. What an introduction, eh? Actually, most of the time, anybody who knows anything about competitive bodybuilding, by the time you get to stand on stage, you're not very strong at all. You're dehydrated, weak, feel a little bit rubbish, to be honest. But the journey there is quite an interesting one. And it's definitely not the only aspect of my character. Somebody introduced them to me the other day by saying, I know about you, Cass, and said, I know you're an opera singer. So there are, if you end up stalking me anywhere in various social media platforms, you will discover that alongside my far too many years to admit experience in the industry, I started working at 19 years old, selling low-sec when Astra was just Astra. I've had quite a diverse experience of industry, pharmaceutical, healthcare, drug interaction focus, rehabilitation. I've then worked in various organisations in consulting. So I've consulted on strategy, I've consulted on communications, and I then realised that what I really wanted to do was lead teams to not need me to do the consulting myself very often. And eventually I named myself the Resonance Coach just over 4 years ago, 1st of October 2020, made the decision to set my own business up in the middle of the pandemic with a deep and genuine focus on what does resonant leadership mean? What is it when we resonate with what's really going on around us? My focus has always been on how are we with each other, which is why the topic of toxic leadership, and particularly the whole toxic boss or toxic employee narrative, is something I find interesting, intriguing, and I would have said experienced until I realized I knew a bit more about it than that. And so my absolute life journey is about understanding, why is it that we behave the way we do with each other? What's our responsibility as individuals in all the relationships that we have, particularly in work environments where we're in teams? How can we operate with, and this is totally stolen from Ted Lasso, curiosity over judgment? How often could we be saying, I wonder why they are, than I don't like that they are? And the focus that I take now is in coaching teams together. So I spend a lot of time coaching leadership teams, particularly I'm lucky enough to work with some of the founding members of Phraktion on various projects that we've pulled together, which are always around, how does the team operate together? Because everything I talk about and everything I do has always been about relationship. What is it about us and what is it about the other? I'm pretty sure I would have been a relationship counsellor if I'd had a different life journey. And I hadn't been an opera singer as well, but for another day. So I'm here to share my experience and my view, and to ask the question, is there really any such thing as a toxic boss? And what kind of conversation could that generate between us? I have no desire to end up saying, yes, I'm right and no, you're wrong, or anything like that. And I hope that what will come across from me is that I have some pretty strong views. I have some strong opinions. But what goes alongside that is a desire to understand why that might be different to other people's opinions, why the position I've been in various roles is different to others, and how I've ended up being where I am. So I thought this particular topic, which every time I look on any social media platform, whether I'm on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram, or my daughter's on TikTok or anywhere, toxic leadership and toxic bosses and toxic parents and all of those phrases appear a lot. Yesterday was the first time, probably because it's in my diary that I'm doing this today, that I saw another really well-known leadership coach based in the US talk about toxicity not being about an individual, and actually posing the same challenge that I did, which is, maybe it's not them, maybe it's the way that we see how they are, and maybe it's the way that they see us too. So that's who I am. I'm here to put that out there and see what kind of questions come up, what kind of experiences we all have, and how those experiences can help us, not help other people necessarily, but help ourselves better manage the relationships that we're currently in. Because sometimes us deciding that someone else is the good guy or the bad guy has more of an influence on us than it does on them. So when we think about toxic leadership, do we believe it's a personal trait or something else? How many of us can immediately think of individuals that we would describe as either just toxic leaders, or the most toxic person I've ever met, or the most toxic boss I ever had the misfortune of? And do we believe that that is their entire personality? Do we think that that's just a bad person? Or do we think that could be about how we relate to them? Could it be an opinion or a view that we have about who they are? Could it be, and forgive me for using this overused word, that they are triggering our triggers? And so we determine the relationship we're going to have with them based on whether we like what they're doing or not. And as I said before, I'm here to hear what everybody else might think. I'm hoping that some of you will start writing frantically in the chat as we're talking, and some of you will end up asking questions. But as a first point of view, what goes on in your mind when you think, is this a personal trait or could it be something else? And you're invited to either share that in the chat or just have it held in your mind to see whether or not it stays the same way, or whether or not it shifts and changes as we go through what I'm planning to share over the next about 50 minutes. So if you go and try and find a dictionary definition for toxic leader or toxic boss, there are many actually, and the beautiful, wonderful Wikipedia has a particular description which says, this is the person who abuses the leader-follower relationship, the person who puts you in a position where you feel that you have no power, and an organization ends up being left in a worse place than it started. That's the current definition. Now, all of you know that Wikipedia is something you could go and decide to edit for yourself. But what is quite interesting is that we've been talking about toxic leadership in some way in the literature since the 90s, really. It's when some of the first literature started to emerge. And there was a particular journal article written in 94, if you want to go read it, that started to describe petty tyranny in organizations, the impact that having a small tyrant in an organization might have. And what's quite interesting is if you do some research into this, the majority of toxic bosses are not necessarily the leaders of the organization. They tend to be somebody who sits in the midst of the organization. And perhaps that explains why sometimes that toxicity, if you like, starts to last. The toxic leader term was really popularized in some articles written by Wicker in 96. And you will be able to find, you go Google them, and there are plenty of places where you can find articles that absolutely strongly argue that people are just toxic. If you let certain people become bosses or leaders or managers, they're going to be bad for everyone else and probably themselves. And that there's nothing you can do about it, which, to be honest, is probably the reason why I find it so fascinating. The suggestion that there's nothing that those people could do about it, and you just have to either put up with it or leave, which is one of the reasons I find this topic so interesting. Because one of the things I think about toxic leadership or a toxic boss or a toxic person as a definition is it suggests that you, the person who's the victim of the toxicity, let's say, is powerless. It says that this person is being toxic to you, at you, around you. And I always want to ask the question, well, where does that then leave you? What are you doing? What are you allowing? So a couple of questions that I thought worth sharing were, what immediately comes to mind when you hear the word toxic leader, or maybe even who immediately comes to mind when you hear that term? And is that because of something you've heard from somebody else who reported to you about a toxic leader, or is that because of an experience you personally had? And I'm very happy to share the experiences I had that I would have previously defined as having a toxic boss. I deliver a lot of training for the Blanchard companies, actually, but one of the training programs I deliver, there is an individual who is an actor in the midst of some of the videos we show, and she is the spitting image of the only person I have ever left a job and walked out the door within an hour because she was my manager. And every time I watch this video, I realize how much this actor, bless her, she's just playing a role that's not very nice, reminds me of this human in her behavior, in her dismissal of others, but also because she physically looks like this person I was once led by. So this is not me sitting here saying I don't think there's any such thing as a toxic boss, because I've never experienced anybody bad who I thought treated me badly, to the point where when I saw this individual about 2 years after I left the business and I happened to be pregnant, I met her in a ladies' toilet. I was leaving and she was walking in, and I said, hello, how are you? And she said to me, I'm fine, thank you. How are you? And I said, great, thanks very much. And she said, good, you look fat. And I use that story a lot because everybody's reaction is the same. I also, by the way, have an unbelievable memory for detail. I'm not one of those people who's ever made up words. I remember whole conversations. So everybody who ever works with me, bear that in mind. But what I remember was at the time feeling, firstly, emotional, angry about it, as anybody would. But secondly, very rapidly, and maybe this is why I do what I do, asking myself, what would make someone behave that way? Yeah, maybe. Thanks, Bob. I'll take that. I'll take that. What would make somebody, because most of us, I don't know about you lot, but I wake up in the morning and I don't think, whose day can I wreck today? I wake up in the morning, sometimes a bit too tired, sometimes wishing I didn't have to do certain things, but mainly intending to be a good person. Thank you, Maggie. Wanting to do a good job. They argue that even psychopaths don't wake up in the morning thinking, I'm going to ruin someone's life today. They wake up in the morning believing they're going to do something that makes them happy. And it is their inability to understand how other people feel or to empathize with how others feel that actually causes them to behave in certain ways. My Ted Bundy story might be for another day. But yes, as Maggie said, maybe that's their insecurity. Maybe somebody who doesn't feel great about themselves behaves in a certain way. And maybe our immediate response to those who are toxic towards us is to defend ourselves because we believe that what they're saying can't be true. And maybe what we could be doing, particularly if we work in organizations where we're in leadership, is asking ourselves how we could help those people, even if it is help them to exit the business, because sometimes that's the thing to do. But start with curiosity over judgment. That doesn't mean it's okay for her to say to me, you look fat, or unless it was a compliment. I don't think she meant it as a compliment. I didn't feel that was the energy coming from her. But when we think of our own experience, do we also know the circumstances under which people behave the way that they do? How many of us have never said something to somebody we care about that we immediately regretted afterwards? Hasn't needed to say, I'm sorry. Hasn't needed to take a deep breath and go, oh my goodness, what happened to me today? And is it possible that some of that toxicity we see is an extension of that is unresolved? Yeah. If we don't understand people, we can brand them as toxic. If we don't want to understand, we can say that just makes you a bad person and me a good person. And thank you for that story, because if somebody's lonely, if somebody is in pain, they tend to cause others pain. I happen to know now that this woman was never able to have children of her own. And she had adopted children, but it had taken her a long time to get there. That doesn't mean that what she says to me is excusable. And I'm using quite an extreme example, aren't I? Doesn't mean it's excusable, but it might be understandable. And maybe certainly all of us with the experience we have in our industry and in the workplace could be thinking about this slightly differently. Some of the characteristics that are branded a toxic leader are being glib, having superficial charm, saying things because they've remembered to write it down. I once had a manager who I actually really like, who couldn't remember that he needed to ask people how they were. So he put reminders in his Outlook calendar. But what was interesting is not only did he say, oh, Cass, good morning, how are you? He'd say, my phone's just reminded me. So the intention was good, but his charm was not something that came naturally to him. Yes. And that's a really good question, Thomas. Is this about creating a climate rather than just having a bad moment? And I would argue, Thomas, that yes, actually it is. And the question I want us to start thinking about is, how is it possible for someone to start creating a climate rather than just having a bad moment? Because some of the things we think of toxic leaders are people who are grandiose. They have an overinflated sense of self-worth. They seem to think they're better than they are. I'm sure all of us can remember at least one example of that. Even if it's not someone who is our boss, we can think of probably world leaders we immediately think might have some of those characteristics. Some of these individuals could be described as pathological liars. And pathological lying basically means that you don't really know that you're lying. You think in the moment you're telling the truth, which is something that's worth remembering. Truth and lies, incidentally, everyone, are pretty subjective. Can be cunning or seen as manipulative because they may take credit for work that someone else has done or fail to admit when they've done something wrong. Perhaps because they don't see that they've done something wrong. which then lines up with the idea that they lack remorse or guilt. Why would I say sorry? Did I do something wrong? Lacking empathy. Now, we all probably know people who we consider friends, maybe even people in our lives, in our family that we love, that are not as empathetic as we'd like them to be. But when that gets to an extreme, we think about that as being a lack of empathy, a callousness, do you not think about anyone else? And a shallowness. You don't really know what's underneath. As I said, I found out later that I could understand why this person behaved in a particular way towards me. It didn't make it okay, but I could understand it. However, unless that person lets us know who they are and why they're behaving that way, how can we support them, help them, or indeed, sometimes support and help means dismissing them from organisation. And I wonder how much responsibility we have as individuals, but even more so as organisations, for failing to accept responsibility for their own actions. And one of the reasons I thought, as I was putting this together, it was such an interesting topic to talk about in Phraktion, is that it could be that as you enter fractional work and you move around teams and you're not there for very long, that if you experience toxicity from someone, you might decide it's not worth saying anything about. How many times in your career have you said it's not worth saying anything? Doesn't really matter that much. Have you gone home and talked about someone's behaviour and then afterwards wished that you'd spoken to them directly? One of the first things we tend to say to the people that we spend a lot of time with, if they're complaining about someone, is, have you told them? And I don't think there is an actual poll on how many times we said no, but it's probably more than yes, isn't it? Now, we can all recognise either some of these or all of these characteristics in individuals we might call toxic, we might have heard about if we've not experienced. And here's the thing about every single one of these characteristics. It comes from a very specific piece of research. Now, we all have, I hope you know, and if you don't know, go and do some reading on it. We all have the potential to behave like psychopaths. Psychopathic behaviour is behaving in a way that you believe serves you without considering the impact it has on others. That's its very basic definition. I'm not going to get too much into the scientific terms. Some of you will know those better than me. But it is based on the premise that the individual is behaving in a way that protects themselves for whatever reason they want to, and they're not thinking about whether or not you like it. And immediately I feel myself wanting to say, but when you take on management or leadership responsibility, don't you know that it's not about you anymore? Don't we say that when we train managers, when we train leaders? Do we not tell them that? And I would argue the answer is not always no. What we know, particularly in our industry and in most, let's be honest, in order to progress, you have to manage others. And we can all immediately think of probably 5 people who should never have been allowed to manage anybody. I've worked with individuals who've said that. Please don't put me in charge of a team because it brings out the worst in me. And still the organisation put that person in charge of a team because we needed an extra manager. And if it's the only way to progress, I wonder when, and this is maybe not answered by today, I wonder when we're going to work out that not everyone is meant to lead others, because we can all between us, that's 30 people. No, it's not. It's 50 people. There's 50 people at least we've already thought of who shouldn't be leading others because they might not be the same people we're thinking of. So if we operate in a world that says in order to be seen as successful and to progress, you have to manage others, is it surprising that some of the people who end up managing, whether they know it for themselves or not, actually end up failing? and doing some damage to others, and possibly, I would argue, to themselves. Yes. And I think that's a really good point, Paul. There's something about a boss being directive, tough, harsh. And what I'm noticing at the moment, I don't know if anybody else is seeing this too, is almost this duality. One is, in order to lead others, you need to be able to be direct. You need to give them instruction. You need to take charge. Yes, and The Apprentice does this. And also, whatever the thing is that Gordon Ramsay's doing at the moment, where he's doing a really, really good impression of The Apprentice, but for chefs. It's literally like we're watching The Apprentice, but with cooking. So there is this makes good television. It doesn't make great entertainment for the rest of us, though, does it, when we're watching it in real life?
No.
So, and when I say I think there's a duality, is we have this one track which is saying this is what means that you're telling people whether they're good enough or not. But the equal and opposite track that says you need to be a coach, you need to be a coach, you need to be a coach. Exactly that, Bob, as somebody who delivers for Blanchard all of the time. Be a coach, be a coach, be a coach. And what we're not necessarily seeing is what happens in the middle. If I don't know what I'm doing and I've just started a new job or a new goal or a new task, or I've just started being a manager of others and I have no idea how to do it, no amount of you coaching me is going to teach me how, because coaching is about asking me what I think should happen. And if I've got no idea, the answer is going to frequently be, I've got no idea. So we're sitting in this bowl of bad historic leadership has been bossy, directive, harsh, dictatorial. Be a coach. But we're not necessarily seeing the thing in the middle. And what we are definitely seeing, as we've all said, is in order to progress in our industry, or any, it's definitely not just us, you have to manage other people to prove that you're good enough to do the next thing, whatever the next thing might be. And maybe the next thing, in an ideal world, would be saying, I'm not supposed to lead people. How can I be a specialist? I think that maybe that's a webinar for another day. I'd love to see that as a debate. How could we find a way to progress in any industry without making people manage other people to show that they're good enough? And what's the impact of that? Because although I'm not going to present the whole drama triangle, I am going to say that the traditional way that we see toxic leadership is this. Toxic leaders are the perpetrators. They're the baddies. They're the bad people. They've got no empathy. They don't care. They call you fat when you're pregnant. They don't talk to you. They talk about you. They're mean. They're unkind. They phone you at 3 a.m. They tell you have to work till 2 a.m, whatever it is. And they are the perpetrators. And the employees, or the person, you might also be a leader yourself, is the victim. Because if it wasn't that there was this frame, and yes, we can talk about the rescuer in a whole other conversation, but we won't do that today. In order for the person to be toxic to you, you have to be the victim of toxicity. And as I said right at the very beginning, I argue, and the teams of people that I work with frequently find themselves realizing that it is by deciding they're the victim that they continue to give the perpetrator a role. You're doing this to me. And because what we don't tend to do is give people the right environment to call it out, to tell somebody they're behaving in a way that's unacceptable because we care rather than because we hate them, we keep ourselves as the victims. And all the time that we have a victim, there is a perpetrator. And all the time that we are a victim, we have no power. Now, I've talked about some very small examples of my experiences, so please do not think I am not aware of or been part of. I was an HR director for a while, organisations and conversations where the things that have been done are much worse. Absolutely. But what I do know is that we were in organisations and spaces where what we didn't do was create a safe place to address it, to call it out, to say, it's not okay for you to say that to me. and to give those who felt they were victims the kind of tools, and I don't mean that in some sort of list of things the way you could do it, but real, proper giving feedback tools that allow them to say, we have to talk about this. This is how your behaviour is impacting me. This is what I need to stop, and this is what I need to start. And instead, we're creating organisations, I fear, where we just look the other way. Because it's the organisation's behaviour that says it's okay to be a certain way or not. It's the response of the organisation, whoever we think has authority or power, that really lets us know what's okay or not. One of the most uncomfortable stories I ever heard was where somebody during the pandemic was working out of an office, and their boss was in the office, and their boss had been drinking. And whilst they were drinking, they phoned the employee and told them they were about to drive home. And it was very evident that they were drunk. Just use the sensible, simple word. And the employee said to them, you can't drive home. You must not drive home. And the abuse that the employee received as a result of suggesting that this person shouldn't drive home was quite incredible. It continued for so many hours into the evening that they recorded it because they didn't think anyone would believe them. And this is a story I was told rather than, I'm proud to say I wasn't, I don't know actually. Maybe I'd rather be proud to say I did something about it. I wasn't in the organisation. The response of the HR team was to invite them both to get into a meeting together and apologise to each other. To each other. Now, that might have been something that became necessary at some point, but I don't think anybody ever being made to say sorry to anybody made anything better, did it? And incidentally, I don't necessarily believe it's about taking sides. I would love to know why somebody's in an office during a pandemic drinking and then decides to drive home. That's my first thought. But of course, by the time you get to the kind of abuse that was laid out to the person trying to stop them, we stop caring about the person who's been drinking in the office since 10 o'clock in the morning. So the question I ask is, what are we doing in the organisation that says we can honestly, straightforwardly, safely talk about situations that we don't want to admit happen? We can give somebody feedback because they need to hear it, because we care more about them than we care whether they like us for telling them, which is one of my favourite phrases to talk about when it comes to feedback. Like, either I care about you or I care whether you like me or not. And caring that you like me or not because I'm lying to you or telling you the truth, for me personally, I'm not even slightly interested in that if it means I've got to lie to you. Or not lie, but not say, which, by the way, is still lying. That's definitely my opinion. It is the culture of our organisations, as you've all mentioned already, that makes us start to believe that people are toxic leaders. Sometimes what happens is the loveliest, kindest people who become managers start to emulate the behaviours that we least want in our business because they think it's the way to get ahead. Well, they get away with it, so maybe it works. Ultimately, leadership is about helping people do their jobs so they don't need you to do it for them. Being the person who either is able to help them do what they need to do or knows exactly who they need to speak to get it done. And if, by the way, needs to speak to you to get it done means that you ask a question, they talk, you shut up and you listen until they've talked through the problem themselves and come up with the answer, that's coaching. That's still leadership. Who's leading the leaders who are behaving in a way that we've decided are toxic? What feedback are they getting? Do they know it's not okay? Have we created a culture and environment in our organizations where people who are experiencing toxic leadership, in inverted commas, know exactly who to speak to make it stop, and feel like they could tell the person who's being toxic towards them what they need to hear? And I would argue that in the majority of the organizations we work in, unfortunately, we don't have that amidst any levels of any leadership or non-leadership. It's rare that even senior leadership teams who've worked together for 20 years actually tell each other the truth. But what about the wider context? Getting quite into, so what happens between people? What about beyond that? If it's a reflection of the culture and structure of the organization, is it that we've tried to create a flatter structure and so nobody knows who to speak to when there's something going wrong? Or is it that there's so much hierarchy? I'm seeing a wry smile from Steve. I have a feeling he's experienced some of those flat kind of structures. Or is there so much hierarchy in the organization that you think, well, the only person I can go to is my boss's boss's boss, and they're definitely going to be on their side? Because we don't know them well enough. We don't understand what the process of talking in the organization really is. Do we care about the external pressures that are influencing? When we talk about leadership, it's just a human behavior. As I said, do we care what's happening to the people who are behaving in an unacceptable way? Have we considered asking everyone in our organization to think, if I was going to be curious rather than judgmental, if I was going to ask myself, I wonder what's going on with them before I decide I do or don't like them, would that change the way I have the conversation with them? Do we know the difference between leadership and management? To Bob's point about servant leadership. Do we tell people what it means legally to be a manager and then forget to teach them what leadership is? And as I just mentioned, is the leadership team setting behavioural standards? Do we talk to each other about what's going on? Or does everybody know what's going on between us because we talk about it with other people or factions of our leadership team? Because even though we don't have as many kitchens and water coolers and coffee machines as we used to before 2020, somehow those conversations are still going on, aren't they? It's not the case that because we don't all have an office to go to anymore, those conversations aren't happening. What we know, one of the reasons I do what I do, is that even if you weren't in the boardroom or the Zoom room, we know what's going on with our leadership team. We can feel it. Sometimes we can hear it. Sometimes we just see it in the things that are and are not said. So maybe there's a reason why we view somebody as being a toxic leader. And if we do, and if we're right about it, let's just use the word right for a moment, then in this context, do we know what we're supposed to do about it? So to ask yourself the question, do toxic leaders just emerge as individuals with a really bad character flaw? Let's just use the word bad for a minute, because let's assume we don't think it's good. Or is it driven by organisational culture? In the example I gave of somebody saying, please don't give me a team. Incidentally, they had about 18 months previously thrown their own team under the bus and told the story and managed to survive it. If they say, don't do this, and we still do it, does that happen? Or is it something that somebody just is? I wonder if the people they live with think they're toxic. Or does it come out, as you just said, because of their life journey, because of the leadership experiences they've had? For any of you who've ever been on leadership training, particularly the servant leadership or situational leadership or any of that kind of work, or even if you've worked through Dale Carnegie, one of the things they talk about is that we both move away from and towards the behaviours we least like. We tell ourselves a story that says, I'm never going to be like that. And most of the time that is true. But occasionally we meet individuals who've ended up becoming exactly like the thing they were trying to avoid, because they didn't understand what they were really trying to avoid in the first place. One of the arguments about toxic bosses not being a real thing comes from the idea that you can't be a toxic boss if you don't have people to be with. It's what we call a relational dynamic. So unless you are sitting in a room on your own, talking to yourself, and you happen to have more than one personality, you could argue we were being toxic towards some of those other personalities. And I see the smiles, but I also think we probably all have realized that there's some people who might be doing that. But it's a relational dynamic. If I haven't got somebody to be toxic towards, the perpetrator can't be the perpetrator unless they have a victim. So if you have or have not, or know or don't know anyone who's ever experienced a toxic leader, in my experience, one of the best questions we can ask ourselves and the people we're trying to help is, what's your power in this? Not blame or fault or role or part, because all of those words sound like you're telling me it's my fault. The actual question is, what's your power in this? And if the response is, I don't have any power, say, could you leave the relationship? And we've all probably had those conversations which end up with, yes, I need the job and I can't get another job and and all of those other things. But we all have got enough experience to know that really, really, we have power. We have authority over every single behavior we have. And if you don't like your boss anyway, and they're toxic towards you anyway, and you think the only other alternative is that you lose or leave your job, what harm would it really do to tell them not why their behavior is bad, but how their behavior is impacting on you? I'm experiencing the way you're behaving in this way. I mean, we've all been to some sort of giving feedback in a really good way classes at some point in our career, yeah? And the best way to give feedback is not to go, you're rubbish, this is why. The best way to give feedback is say, I'm experiencing this. This is what I'm seeing. Whilst I'm giving you this feedback, would you be okay just to listen, to write some stuff down? And if you've got any questions, if you've got anything you want to say, there might be things that you disagree with, that's all fine. Let's leave that until I've said to you the things I need to say. And the reason I'm giving you this feedback is because I care. By the way, caring about something isn't the same thing as liking them or loving them or wanting to spend all your time with them. I'm telling you because I care. And really, underneath all of it, this is the counselor in me. The reason we do anything is because we care about ourselves. Yes. And here's an interesting question, Thomas. How do we then handle situations where we realize the person isn't interested in us? How can we utilize that knowledge to take us back here? Because by definition, if they're your leader or your boss or your manager, whatever term we're using, they need to be interested in you. And if they're not interested in you, I'm just going to say it, it might be time for us to go. Because the only power we all have really is over ourselves. We can say, I don't want to be treated this way. We can say, I don't like it. I don't want to be here. You're wrong. Ultimately, the only thing we can control, because incidentally, we can't even actually control our emotions, everyone. We can just manage them and put them in a different box for later. The only thing we can control are the actions we take. We don't get to control our thoughts. They're there. We get to choose which ones we follow. Our feelings come because we are emotional beings, but we do get to control what we do. And sometimes the thing we need to do, if the giving of feedback has been done, or we decide it's just not worth it, is that we do walk away. Because I argue that we can only have somebody being toxic to us if we're there to be toxic too. And if we somehow, and this can be really hard to think of or hear for ourselves, somehow we're allowing it. Somehow we're saying it's okay. And sometimes you may have observed this in others. You may have realized upon reflection at some point in your career, this was happening to you. Sometimes what you're receiving from somebody is simply a reflection, not of what you're putting out, but of how they see you experiencing the world. Sometimes they are behaving towards you the way that they think is the right way to behave. And I'm not even slightly surprised if I see furrowed brows and uncertainty. But if we go back to our original premise that everybody wakes up in the morning intending to do a good job or have a good day, even the psychopaths, just for a moment, I don't know if any of you, depending on where you are in the world, there was an amazing documentary done about Ted Bundy. And the only reason I say amazing is that grown women and men wept when they were watching it, because they realized that this person, who was known for committing some of the most horrific crimes towards men in the history of the world for individuals, the reason he did it is because that's how he was taught he would receive love as a child. You don't have to go and watch it. If you want to read the summary of it somewhere, I think it's fascinating, because I use that person as such a strong example of something we would all agree is not okay, to reflect on the idea that people do what they do because they think it's going to get them something or stop them being hurt. So if this person's behavior is toxic, it might not be about you. What else could it be reflecting that means that they think they have to behave this way? And as I said at the very beginning, I don't particularly want to be right. In fact, not even saying particularly sounds like I do really. I don't care about being right at all. It doesn't interest me. What interests me is inviting people to think differently about each other, particularly when you end up working with people that you're supposed to sort of get on with. Sometimes we label somebody as toxic and later it emerged that something else was going on. We've all probably worked with people that we realize later were not doing a particularly good job at the time because of something that was happening for them that they just didn't want anyone to know about. And we wish that they told somebody so that they had a reason to behave the way they did. And I'm not talking just about toxic behavior, but sometimes just loss of performance in a job can be about something else going on. We don't always know, but maybe something else is happening. And then as soon as we start using the word toxic, a bit like servant or heart-led, how does that start to influence the dynamic within a team or an organization? What starts happening when we start using the word toxic in an organization? And is it good? Could it start to excuse some behavior? Could it make it possible for more and more people to behave in ways that we don't think is acceptable anymore? Because suddenly this is an organization where this happens. It's a question that occurred to me. And before we move on to then, so what could we do about it? Because I'm conscious of time. If anyone has any questions or thoughts about everything I've talked about so far, I've deliberately whited the screen. Please do ask or share.
Yes, this is Tom. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can see you.
Okay.
I've been watching your facial expressions. I love it when people have their cameras on.
I mean this in a complimentary way, but I'm dangerously close to laying down on the red sofa in the back of my office right now. This has been very reflective.
Well, I'm glad I now know it's a red sofa. It's my favorite color.
It's very reflective. And I think I had jotted some things down, and you touched on all of them. I think about the value of difficult discussions. It's not my natural tendency, but I've had them up and down and professionally done. I mean, I think they are so important, and tears and screaming, all those things go with the moment. But 24 hours later, there seems to be, productivity out of that. So I think that is so important. And then I think, the reflection you talked about, putting that mirror up in front of you, letting, just say, this is a conversation, we need to have respect. I'm not going to participate in this discussion if this is the way you're going to speak to me. I mean, some of those kinds of tools, I think are really helpful as well. I'll just make kind of a final comment. These are just all editorial. I reflected back on several experiences, and many of them I care not to revisit, or they're not bothering me. I have one that happened, it's probably 7-8 years. And to this day, I am thinking about revisiting it with the individual and maybe bringing some closure to that. It just left at a spot that it didn't need to. Person lives locally, and it's just one that just got really unfortunately toxic as part of discussions. But I am thinking about going back and closing the loop on that one. And so it's something I've been thinking about, and I'll give you an update someday on how that goes.
Thank you, Tom. Tom, thank you for all of those reflections. And as you said, I'm hoping you can tell, I'm a great believer that I'm intrigued by the idea, and Paul's heard this at least 3 times over the last few weeks, that we use the same word to describe difficult conversations as we do war. The word conflict.
Well, I
think that's fascinating. Go on, Maggie.
I was going to say, I think it takes a lot of courage to have those conversations. So the other part of war, the more heroic, I think that people underestimate the impact that having a straightforward, candid conversation, given in the right tone, given in all the right setting, can really help turn things around. And sometimes employees can be toxic, and if not addressed, it causes other issues around the organization. And I always applaud people. I look at feedback as their kernels of gold, and I always tell people that, because it takes a lot for someone to say something. So when they do, take it and take it as the treasure that it's meant to be.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Cass, it just reminds me, many years ago, tomorrow's a surreal twist of fate. I'm pitching to a friend of mine I worked with 20 years ago. He was a consultant. We had a really difficult boss, and she worked the team relentlessly and worked the team very long hours, and she believed they loved working for her. And he was a consultant, and he just said to her one day, he said, "Do you know what? The team don't want to be here." And she went, No, they want to be here. They love it. He said, "Go home early tonight and sit in your car." So she sat in her car. As soon as she sat in her car, the whole team left. Next day she came and she cried her eyes out to him and said, "I can't believe that I was doing that to my team." He had the courage to confront her. And I think she's gone stratospherically high now in her career. And I think it was a massive change for her, because she suddenly realized what she was doing to her team and didn't realize. Very powerful. And he's an amazing guy, because he's utterly fearless. Just he'll call it out to anybody. And I think that is an amazing attribute as a human being.
Thank you for that story, Paul. Well, as we all said, people don't wake up in the morning deciding to try and F everybody else's life up. That's not what we do. We've all got so much other stuff to think about. And yet sometimes it appears that that's what's happening. And sometimes it's not about resolving the conflict. Sometimes it's just about talking about the conflict. It's about finding a way to agree to disagree and saying we will move forward anyway, Let's decide how we're moving forward. And sometimes moving forward is separating. But as you've all said, the whole reason for even thinking about talking about toxic bosses is, what is it that we're doing or not doing that means we're not making it any better? We might not be making it worse, but we're certainly not making it better yet. Steve, did you want to add something? I see you unmuted yourself.
So yeah, no, I was just going to ask Cass what you think about, because for me sometimes it's the words and it's the language we use that can sometimes sometimes we rush to hyperbole at the moment. So there's a difference between occasional difficult behavior and then leapfrogging straight into that person being a toxic boss. But one thing that I've kind of keep coming across in some of the literature is to label the behavior rather than the person. I wondered what you felt about that, in terms of always talking about toxic behavior rather than a toxic boss. Because I think, again, a lot of people have, learned behavior from their families, things that I look back on now as a child in my kind of family units that I took for granted. And then, you look back in decades later and go, oh my word, I never realized that other people didn't behave that way.
That is such a great example. One of my favorite examples I draw out in just about every workshop I run is the way we're taught to use our knife and fork.
Mm-hmm.
which is pretty innocuous, yeah. It's not, doesn't necessarily raise eyebrows, exactly. or unless you were in a very English household where you have your fork in your left hand always and your knife in the right. And the reason I use it is because arguably it doesn't hurt anybody ever to decide that you're going to put your knife and fork the other way around, or just use your fork, or eat with your fingers. But it's one of the things, to your point about how we were brought up to be told what was right. That's how we created our ego, was on the basis of the places we felt safest or least safe. And what we then decided is that's the truth. That's the way. Some people were brought up in households where they were encouraged to constantly have what we would describe as arguments at the dinner table, in order to develop different perspectives, to be able to debate, to learn, to become more articulate. And yet those same people in the leadership team meeting are the ones who you're wishing would just shush and stop asking another difficult question. Because it comes back to, as you all said in different ways, what's the norm for me? And do I realize that it's the norm rather than just right? So, but to go back to your original question, yes, it's not the person, it's what they're doing. Me walking the way I walk, or eating the food I eat, or weeping at certain films, or getting angry at certain things, or choosing one word or the other, isn't who I am. It's the behavior I'm displaying. And as soon as we try to give feedback about the person and we don't talk about the behavior, rightly, we feel attacked. It's like, you're being, you're doing, you are, every time you, because as you say, we move to hyperbole. We immediately go, this happens all the time. Well, actually, it's 3 times and it's only ever been in the last 3 months. So yes, give the feedback because you care and express it to people. Like constructive feedback. I'm telling you this because I care. I'm not telling you this because I hate you. We've just said it takes courage. I'm telling you because I care about you knowing more than I care about you liking me. And actually, I use that phrase a lot because you can imagine, give very direct feedback. And the way that I do that with the people I care about is go, I'm telling you this because I care more about you than I care that you're going to smile at me at the end of this conversation. And that reminds them that you're doing it for them. Is how do you get people to actually say sorry? To admit that what they were doing wasn't ideal, wasn't right, was wrong, without being punished, because actually saying sorry is probably enough. And particularly for English speaking organizations, using the words I'm sorry, not I apologize.
I apologize because you thought that perhaps maybe I did. That's
the difference. That's not true in all languages. It's worth checking, because in some of the teams I've worked with, actually saying apologies, thank you, Bob, so much, is saying I'm sorry, taking responsibility. And then asking yourself, how can you, particularly if you're coming into an organization for a short period of time, how do you start the culture with you, where people want feedback rather than avoid it? I am very happy for anyone to send me questions after today's session. I'm in the group. I'm definitely on LinkedIn. That's deliberately my profile picture that was right at the front, so you know it's me. There's two of us, but I'm the only one who looks like me. Questions, challenges, thoughts on any of this, I would love to hear. And if anybody wants to say to have a chat about it before we close, after we stop the recording, then I'm not going anywhere in a hurry. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invitation to be here from Nigel and Paul and everyone else. Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cass.
That was great.
Thank you.
Thanks a
So
lot.
welcome.
Great day.
Thank
Cass,
you, Maggie.
can I just
Of
make
course
one
you can,
comment,
Mark.
Cass?
Mark.
Yeah, of course.
I've really
Hi,
enjoyed
Mark.
this. It's kind of I don't know if it was Steve or Paul that said it's kind of sent a little bit of a shiver down my spine, because I spent 10 years in banking at the highest level, reporting to the CEO, and saw a lot of this behavior. And so what it's done, which has been really good, is it's kind of presented that whole other side that, to have a toxic leader, you kind of have to have that mirrored victim that's willing to play that role. But the thing that I felt a bit uncomfortable about is that we're not positing a moral equivalence here. I mean, I think it still is really important to recognize the fact that a lot of the toxic behavior I saw was coming from someone who was 2 or 3 or 4 levels higher than the person that it was being addressed to. And everything that you've kind of said, which makes total sense about pushing back and, responding, this is how I feel, can I take some time and can you listen? And very, very difficult to do with certain individuals.
Very
So it was
difficult.
just that comment that I think it's been superb at painting that other side of the picture. And of course, what you have posited is the only way out of that awful, vicious circle of toxicity. But that, boy, there was such a power imbalance that it sounds easier than it was to do.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I think we all have said it's even in that equivalence where I feel like this person's sitting right here, it's not easy. So I don't underestimate that at all. One of the things that I did have a particular situation a few years ago where I was consulting with a team where that was happening, and interestingly they were in finance, not in banking, but in finance, and we talked about, so who can help you? And I think that's one of the things which maybe isn't, I think we should add it in actually somewhere in the slides, which is about, it doesn't have to be you. You need to tell someone, and you need to decide what you're going to do, but who can it be when it is, as you say there? And in those organizations, as you know better than I do, the hierarchy is vast. It feels like literally steps up into parliament. It's huge, because we believe, the people that I do a lot of leadership coaching with, we really believe that leadership is about giving people the help that they need. So who is the leader in that organization? Who is there who could be part of that conversation?
Yeah.
And if there isn't someone, then that, from a cultural and from a leadership team point of view, that's the thing that's missing. If you haven't got someone in your team that a brand new, let's say, apprentice could come and say, I don't know if I'm receiving this wrong, or I don't know what's happening, but this is what I'm experiencing, and that person isn't sitting there looking the way we just did, aghast at what's happening, then that organization unfortunately won't fail in the way we might like it to, in order to show them what needs to change. But that's one of the questions we ask leadership teams, is if someone can't come directly to you, who's the person they get to go to that you'll listen to? And rather than being annoyed they didn't come directly to you, you will know there's a really good reason why they've gone to this individual instead. Because so many CEOs and even, senior and second level leadership teams think that they know what's going on with everyone. We still tell ourselves, so I know, well, they come and tell me. I know, because they come and tell me. Like, no, they would have told you maybe 4 years ago. They're not going to tell you now, because you're the boss.
It's a great point, Mark, because Nigel might remember. I'm going to say a name, because this guy's in history now. Do you remember Thomas Ebeling at Novartis?
Name names, absolutely.
Thomas Ebeling used to throw his shoes
Yeah.
in meetings at people. And this guy was stratospherically senior. But eventually the organization did get to him, and he had to have anger management. training. So somebody somewhere
somewhere
eventually
went,
called this guy out and said, you can't act like this anymore. This is unacceptable. And although he was God, you know, he was one off the CEO, his behavior was totally unacceptable, and it created a culture of fear in the organization where people would go to meetings with 1,000 slides because they knew that he was always wanting everything, and you had to have that slide, even if it turned the organization into a slave trade, because people were going into meetings having prepared for 3, 4, 5 days, and it was just unacceptable. So it can change, but it is brutal.
It's not easy.
You hit the nail on the head, though, Paul. For me, you talked about as well, Cass, is that the nub of the solution is culture, and you know, there's the famous phrase that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and often that's used in the positive way, that you've got to get your culture right, and otherwise the strategy is by the by. But you flip it on your head, and if your culture is wrong, then you're not going to get rid of that toxicity. And I'm quite cynical, having been at a small company for nearly 2 decades that grew to quite a decent size. And we had some good behaviours, but we also did know that there was toxic behaviour at the board level, and it never really resolved itself. And that then we put sticking plasters on, we had speak up and tell, but they were just, in my opinion, window dressing. And so unless you take the Patrick Lencioni kind of 5 dysfunctions of the team model and take your senior leadership away for an away weekend every week until they all like each other, I think if the culture's not right at the top, you're not going to fit.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, to be honest, I think that's why I've managed to do any of the work that I do is people suddenly realize it's not their team that's the problem, as in it's not the rest of them, it's not everyone else. It's like, well, what are you doing?
And
as soon as
behavior again, isn't it?
Yeah,
your company is almost like your community, your family, and your senior leaders are the parents. And if you see some of their behavior being excused, then even subconsciously it will still trickle down.
100%, absolutely. And also, just because it's possible to have the conversations doesn't mean that it ever actually happens. We know it's hard, we know it's difficult, we know it takes courage, and also we know sometimes we just think, I don't think I can be bothered, because this is going to take some energy out of me, and I don't know how this team's going to react, so I think I'll just go and do something else. But I always think when I read Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast that he meant it the way you've just described it. I don't think he meant make sure you've got your culture right, because otherwise, your strategy doesn't matter. I think he meant your culture is going to eat everything you ever did for breakfast and spit it out at the end of the
I'm with you.
At the end of the meal. Because it's how we are that it's like, it's true of our families, and our work is not our family. We've all made that mistake at least once in our career, but we behave like a family unit. It has that relational dynamic in it. So if our family can't behave with each other, then it's going to fall apart at some point.
But I like your point about if worst comes to the worst, you can choose to leave. And that's why I think often it's good to describe a close company as a community as opposed to a family, because technically you can't really leave your family unless there's the odd divorce or something, but you can leave a community, you can leave.
You definitely can. Yeah.
It gives us healthy to describe a company as a family almost, I think.
No, I don't think it's healthy at all. I don't think I only describe it that way when I'm talking to people about how similar it is to family relationship counselling.
Yeah.
But no, I think you're right, as a community, and remembering that you can always leave, even with all the stuff that goes with that. The choice you're making is to stay or not.
Some of the behavior I saw was very calculated. I mean, I had a CEO who said, I deliberately yell at people on day 2 to see if they can take it. And I will deliberately operate in a very mercurial way. I will create a kind of walking on eggshells culture precisely to see if you are tough enough either to push back or to call me out about it. Yeah. Now that's a subset of some of the behaviors you were talking about, but that's not kind of toxicity by misadventure. It's deliberate.
Yes.
And in part it's not all the time. And that makes it really, really difficult to cope with. So
exactly.
My
Yeah.
heart went out to people who just suddenly were faced with this and they hadn't seen it before, or people that knew it was coming and thought, okay, well, we just have to kind of hunker down because
Yeah.
in 10 or 15 minutes it will pass and it will be fine.
Mm.
I've been told to go away and immediately fire that person who was 2 layers higher than me because she did so and so in a board meeting. And I've just found strategies of just not acting on it, and then it gets
Yeah.
forgotten. But it's very, very tiring and wearing. And so that was kind of the thing that was going through my mind, that I agreed with everything you were saying. I thought it was fantastic to put that second piece of the puzzle in place. But boy, it's difficult on those, that don't want to be victims, but still find it very difficult to, how do I react in the moment? What can I actually do?
Yeah. And I, if I'm really honest, I think some of the reason we don't know, it's difficult to find out or be taught or get coached is because at the most, let's just keep using the word senior because it's easier, at the most senior level, people don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
They don't know within the most senior people in that team do not know tools, techniques, ways of having conversations, don't think that they're brave enough or can't be bothered to say the difficult thing. That happens so frequently at leadership team level, and there's so much misunderstanding.
Yeah.
I've worked with teams who've been together for 10 years, built the company together, and then we have a conversation. It's not because I think I'm magical, it's because I'm just asking them questions they've never asked each other. And they say, I never knew that about you. Oh,
Yeah.
well, we've seen each other every day for the last 10 years. Did you not know that I always react in that way to this because I was taught this, or this happened to me? Or, when companies decide they're going to sell their organization, they get acquired, and they suddenly realize the reasons they all want to be acquired are completely different to each other because they're not having honest conversations because they've been able to get away with not. Steve's been in exactly that position. So you suddenly go, well, I thought that we were all on the same page. And the answer to that is, well, that's because you didn't check what page you were on.
Yeah. It's interesting, Cass, because I think organizations make excuses for senior people. And the two very bold excuses that were made for this guy was that, don't forget, he's built a whole fixed income business from scratch. We need to cut him some slack. And also, he's very insecure. And so that's why these outbursts happen. Everyone knows it. You just have to suck it up and deal with it. And these were the two kind of myths that kept him in place for such a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, and whether he ever really realized the impact he had on other people or not, we will never know, because he was doing it deliberately. He thought, the thing we were saying earlier on, he thought he was doing the right thing. I mean, we can all see that he wasn't, but he believed, by doing this, I'm going to make sure I've got the right people in my organization. His methodology, shocking, but nobody had said to him, this is not the way.
And then it gets normalized, doesn't it? It's reinforced, and he's thinking, "Oh, this is
That's
great.
just the way he is.
This behavior is making this company great, so I'm going to do more of it."
Exactly. And
then,
as you said, cut him some slack.
Yeah,
it's really tricky.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much. Really
Thank
good.
you very much, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you for those who stayed for this post discussion, and I hope that we get to speak to each other again soon.
Yeah,
you know where to find me.
Super.
Thanks
a lot, Cass.
I think all off for a cup of tea and to lie down on something
on the red sofa, apparently. On the red one. Make sure it's the red one.
But and then maybe we'll give you a call afterwards. But I think generally, thank you again.
Thanks very much.
Just to reflect a little bit, we are a community at Phraktion. People are free to leave, but obviously we want this to be very nice.
But don't.
We need to be a very positive experience for everybody, and we need to get our culture right as well. And as a force of change in the industry for Phraktion, how do we actually go forwards with very experienced people to actually create, a better experience for everybody, a better culture, and how we operate together. So some important messages, I think, there for Phraktion today as well, Cass. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Nigel. You're very welcome.
Come back with maybe some deeper discussions some other time. But hey, Cass, thanks everyone. Back in 2 or 3 weeks with the next webinar, you'll see those details. If not today, probably tomorrow. So look out for that. Okay, thanks everybody.
Brilliant.
See you soon, everyone.
Fantastic.
Bye.
Thanks,
Take
everybody.
care. See you soon. Bye.